They called it white gold. For decades, the cotton fields of Burkina Faso stretched like an ocean across the Sahel, endless, silent, and owned by someone else's market. But this year, that silence broke. For the first time in modern history, Burkina Faso has said no to exporting its raw cotton to the West. A $3.8 billion trade flow, frozen overnight. Machines stopped, contracts collapsed, and somewhere near Ouagadougou, an old farmer named Ibrahim stood beside his stacked bales and whispered, "Maybe this time, we keep what we grow." What followed was nothing short of a rebellion, not of guns but of economics. Ibrahim Traore's government ordered a full halt to raw exports and announced the construction of 4 domestic refineries. Each plant would spin, weave, and dye within national borders. Each job would stay under Burkina Faso hands. Officials called it industrial sovereignty. Critics called it madness. In Ouagadougou, the speech was brief but electric. "We will no longer export poverty in bales," Traore declared, his voice steady, almost defiant. The crowd erupted. For many, it was the first time they had heard the word dignity attached to the soil beneath their feet. Western media reacted with disbelief. Analysts on Bloomberg warned of a dangerous precedent. Traders in Paris whispered about tariffs and retaliation. Yet in the streets of Ouagadougou, women in bright cotton wraps began to sing a different refrain. Our fabric, our future. Burkina Faso has just challenged the oldest rule of global trade, that Africa sells cheap and buys back expensive. But what happens when a nation breaks that pattern? What if this small country at the heart of the Sahel rewrites the supply chain itself? If this story matters for Africa's future, stay with me. Because what's coming next may not just reshape one market. It could ignite a trade war. If this hit you, type, "I am here." If you stand for dignity, press like and stay. If this feels urgent, hit subscribe before you forget. In the weeks that followed Traore's announcement, every cotton field in Burkina Faso became a symbol of defiance. For generations, these fields had supplied Europe's textile mills, silent tributaries feeding the rivers of Western wealth. Now, they were being redirected inward, toward a new and untested dream: industrial independence. The government's plan was as precise as it was radical. 4 major refineries, one in Ouagadougou, one near Ouagadougou, one along the Niger border, and one in the capital itself. Each would turn raw cotton into finished thread, dyed fabric, and eventually clothing marked "Made in Burkina Faso." The cost? Nearly $3.8 billion, drawn from domestic funds and a coalition of AES partners, Mali, Niger, and Guinea, who pledged to share technical support. The goal? 200,000 new jobs within 5 years and a reduction of poverty in rural provinces by at least 20%. Traore's cabinet described it as the beginning of Africa's industrial age, but in the markets of Ouagadougou, it sounded simpler. An old tailor said, "Maybe we can finally stitch our own story." Still, the decision came with risk. Within days, European textile giants canceled purchase orders. U.S. brokers threatened to shift their supply lines to India and Pakistan. The IMF issued a quiet statement warning of market destabilization. But Traore didn't blink. His administration rolled out the Cotton Reinvestment Act, offering tax breaks for local manufacturers and microloans to village cooperatives. The government's message was clear. The age of raw exports was over. Meanwhile, a new image began to emerge across the country. Farmers watched as trucks once bound for foreign ports now carried cotton to local construction sites. Concrete foundations rose where ginning plants had once stood. Women's cooperatives formed sewing circles that evolved into small factories. One group named theirs Les Filles du Faso, the Daughters of Faso, and their first product line bore a simple tag: "Freedom woven here." Western headlines called it reckless populism, but to ordinary Burkinabe it felt like reclamation. Radio hosts played recordings of Traore's speech over slow drums, mixing politics with pride. Children painted cotton flowers on classroom walls, labeling them national treasure. Even local pastors began preaching about the dignity of labor, quoting Traore's words as if they were scripture. Economically, the numbers began to shift. In the first quarter after the ban, domestic employment rose 6%. Import dependency on European fabrics dropped by 18%. And while Western buyers grumbled about supply instability, Chinese and Turkish investors quietly sent envoys to Ouagadougou. The cotton rebellion was turning into a regional magnet. Across the Sahel, leaders took note. Mali and Niger announced joint feasibility studies for shared textile plants under the AES alliance. For the first time, the term value chain sovereignty appeared in the African Union's economic brief. And in Washington, analysts at the U.S. Trade Commission warned Congress that the Sahel bloc may be entering a protectionist phase unseen since the 1970s. But inside Burkina Faso, none of that mattered to Ibrahim, the farmer who once stood beside his silent bales. He had been hired as a foreman at the new Bobo Dioulasso refinery. He told a visiting journalist, "They used to buy my cotton for $4 a kilo. Now they buy my time, my skill, my story. That is worth more." The nation was learning a new rhythm, slower, heavier, but its own. For once, every fiber that left its soil carried a little more meaning, a little more control. Yet, beneath the pride, there was tension. Officials in Brussels and Washington began drafting tariff proposals. Lobbyists for global textile conglomerates called the move economic sabotage. Behind closed doors, a counteraction was forming. If Burkina Faso wanted to change the rules of trade, the West was preparing to remind it who had written them in the first place. If you believe this stand was right, write your city below. If you think it's dangerous, say why. Plain words, no rage. If this made you proud, press like, so it's on record. By mid-year, the tremor had turned into a storm. The European Union announced a sudden 35% import tariff on all refined cotton products from Burkina Faso, labeling them subsidized under state intervention. Washington followed with its own restrictions, citing unfair competitive advantage. In trade terms, it was a direct hit. In political terms, it was a message: stay in your lane. But Traore's response was as measured as it was fierce. At a press briefing carried live across Africa, he said simply, "If our fabric is punished for being African, then perhaps we must wear it ourselves." Within 24 hours, Burkina Faso suspended import licenses for several European textile brands and announced a reciprocal tariff policy called cotton for cotton. Western diplomats called it reckless. In Ouagadougou, crowds called it justice. Protests erupted outside the EU mission, but there was no violence, only music, drums, and the white banners of woven cloth reading, "We spin our own destiny." In the countryside, radio hosts replayed Traore's speech with steady cadence. They once called it aid, we now call it dependence. The balance has changed. For farmers, the impact was real but defiant. Cotton prices inside Burkina dropped briefly, then stabilized as domestic mills absorbed the surplus. In Bobo Dioulasso, the new refinery ran night shifts under generator light. Engineers spoke of doubling production before the year's end. A young woman named Mariama, stitching uniforms in the new textile plant, said quietly, "We are not fighting them. We are finishing what they started, but never wanted us to own." The international press framed it as a brewing trade war. Headlines in London read, "Sahel cotton crisis threatens global supply chain." But African outlets called it something else, the cotton rebellion. And that phrase stuck. From Ghana to Kenya, commentators began debating whether the entire continent should follow Burkina Faso's model: end raw exports, build domestic value, and challenge the hierarchy of global trade. Inside the WTO, emergency consultations dragged on for weeks. European representatives argued that the Sahel bloc was destabilizing the market. African delegates countered that the market had been destabilized for centuries, just not in their favor. It was the kind of debate that reached beyond economics. It touched the moral nerves of the post-colonial world. Traore refused to yield. He appeared on national television, flanked by factory workers and farmers rather than ministers. "Our cotton is not rebellion," he said. "It is remembrance of every hand that worked this soil and got nothing in return." The camera lingered on his face, calm and unshaken. For many Burkinabe watching at home, it felt like the moment their nation finally found its voice. Markets reacted with volatility. Cotton futures spiked 11% in 1 week. Retail prices across Europe ticked upward. But inside Africa, something else was rising: confidence. Mali and Niger accelerated plans for shared textile corridors, and even Ghana's parliament debated its own export ban proposal. The idea was spreading like wind across dry fields. Back in Washington, trade analysts warned that a textile bloc might form under the AES alliance. Some called for sanctions, others urged negotiation. But none could ignore what had just happened. A landlocked country of 23 million had challenged the structure of global commerce and survived the first strike. Traore ended one of his final briefings that summer with a single sentence that echoed far beyond the room. They called it a rebellion. We call it a rebirth. If this story reached you, type awake. If you believe in building, not begging, press like before it is buried. If you want part 2 on Traore's next move, subscribe and stay. The sanctions hurt, but they also healed something deeper. As Western tariffs bit into profits, the cotton mills of Burkina Faso kept running. Men and women who once watched trucks haul their harvests to distant ports were now clocking in for factory shifts before sunrise. The sound of looms replaced the silence of waiting. In the towns of Houndé and Tenkodogo, people began to measure time not by the rains, but by production schedules. They called it the season of work. The numbers told a quiet revolution. Within 12 months, domestic employment rose by nearly 200,000. The textile cooperatives, especially those led by women, became symbols of renewal. Entire families were lifted out of poverty, not by charity, but by machinery. Small towns once dependent on aid convoys now shipped their own finished cloth to Ouagadougou markets under a simple slogan: "We wear what we grow." Traore's administration poured new funds into vocational schools. Young Burkinabe learned not only how to farm cotton, but how to weave, dye, and design it. The Ministry of Education introduced textile engineering courses named after the nation's oldest villages. And in every school book, a new chapter appeared: economic sovereignty. On the streets, the rebellion began to feel like a renaissance. National parades replaced imported fabrics with local designs. Even the military adopted new cotton uniforms labeled Faso-made. In markets, buyers compared local and foreign products, and for the first time, the local ones were chosen with pride, not pity. Elders said, "Our children now build what our fathers only dreamed." But progress carried pressure. Inflation crept upward. Imported goods grew scarce under retaliatory tariffs. Families learned to make do with local substitutes. Still, public sentiment held firm. People said the struggle was worth the discomfort. One shopkeeper put it simply: "Better a short hunger than a long humiliation." Across the Sahel, the ripple widened. Mali, Niger, and Chad began forming a joint cotton corridor initiative under the AES framework: shared logistics, shared power grids, and common tariffs. The phrase West African value chain appeared in the Financial Times for the first time in history. Even in Paris, quiet voices inside trade ministries began asking, what if the old model is truly dying? Meanwhile, in the United States, analysts on CNBC admitted the shift had unexpected durability. American apparel firms quietly approached Burkina Faso through intermediaries, seeking limited exemptions to maintain supply. For the first time, the conversation had flipped. Africa was not pleading for access. The West was negotiating for permission. Back home, factories expanded night shifts. The government launched a new program, Weave for the Nation, linking rural cooperatives directly to export-ready plants. Each month, new images filled social media. Women sewing in open-air halls, children waving the national flag made from the same fabric their parents produced. It wasn't propaganda. It was pride. Still, in private, Traore's advisors worried about the cost. Foreign reserves were shrinking, and the currency faced pressure. But the president's stance remained unchanged. We can rebuild money. We cannot rebuild dignity once it's sold. At the year's end, when the first Burkina Textile Expo opened in Ouagadougou, visitors from 20 African nations attended. There were no luxury lights or polished suits, just rows of plain wooden booths and bolts of bright cloth. A banner at the entrance read, "The rebellion that built a future." People stood before it, some smiling, some silent. They understood. It was no longer about cotton. It was about control, about narrative, about the right to choose one's own poverty or prosperity. If this feels like more than economics, say, "I remember." If you believe nations rise by work, not wishes, press like and stay. And if you think the hardest part is yet to come, you might be right. In Washington, the Cotton Rebellion was first treated as a minor disruption. But by autumn, policy analysts began to sound uneasy. Reports circulated through the State Department warning that Burkina Faso's model may spread faster than anticipated. On Capitol Hill, a senator from Texas asked during a hearing, "What happens if Africa stops selling raw materials altogether?" No one had an answer. At the World Bank, whispers turned into debates. Could the African textile corridor undermine long-term Western trade leverage? Would new alliances form beyond the IMF's reach? Even The Economist, known for its restraint, printed a headline that read, "The day the supply chain snapped back." Europe fared no better. France faced protests from its own fashion industry over soaring prices and shrinking supply. Italy's textile mills reported production delays. Retailers across the continent saw rising costs. Consumers were told to expect the African effect, higher prices tied directly to Burkina Faso's new trade stance. For the first time, Western media used the phrase industrial sovereignty without irony. Meanwhile, new players entered the scene. China dispatched an economic envoy to Ouagadougou, proposing a joint textile zone under the Belt and Road framework. Turkey sent its own delegation to negotiate a long-term investment package. The United Arab Emirates offered to fund a logistics hub at the port of Lomé, granting Burkina indirect sea access for exports. In less than a year, the West's attempt to isolate the Sahel had built its bridge to the east. But beyond politics, there was a shift in perception. American journalists began to frame Traore not as a populist, but as a strategist, one willing to gamble stability for sovereignty. In an interview on PBS, a retired U.S. trade official admitted, "He's not anti-West. He's just refusing to be junior partner. That's what unsettles everyone." Back in Africa, students studied these headlines with quiet satisfaction. For them, it meant their country had finally entered the global conversation as a producer, not a pawn. Burkina Faso had turned an agricultural crop into a diplomatic statement. The question now wasn't whether it could survive, it was whether the world could adapt. If you think the West should negotiate, type your answer below. If you think they'll retaliate harder, mark your prediction for Friday. And if you believe Africa just shifted history, press like before you go. When the first bolts of locally woven fabric rolled off the assembly line, they were not just cloth. They were history, soft, bright, and unyielding. In them were the fingerprints of farmers, the calloused hands of mothers, and the quiet defiance of a nation that refused to remain at the bottom of the chain. Burkina Faso's cotton rebellion began with a ban, but it ended with a belief that true independence is not declared on paper. It is built in factories, classrooms, and fields. The country had not conquered the world, but it had reclaimed itself. And that, in this age of dependency and debt, was nothing short of revolutionary. In Ouagadougou, Ibrahim still works his night shifts at the Bobo Dioulasso refinery. When asked if he misses the old days, he smiles. They said cotton was white gold, he answers softly. But gold belongs to whoever digs it. This belongs to whoever makes it. The trade war never officially ended. Negotiations continue in quiet rooms in Brussels and Geneva. Tariffs rise, meetings adjourn, statements are drafted and retracted. But outside those walls, in the towns and villages of the Sahel, something irreversible has begun. A slow awakening, a sense that value, real value, can finally stay where it is born. Burkina Faso's cotton has become more than a product. It's become a parable, a reminder that even the smallest nation can redraw the map of power if it dares to weave its own future, and that maybe the next global conflict won't be fought over weapons or oil, but over who controls the meaning of work itself. If this story touched you, write, "I remember." If you still believe that dignity and labor are sacred, press like before you leave. If you want to follow where this rebellion leads next, subscribe and stay. May God bless every hand that spins, every heart that believes, and every nation that refuses to sell its soul for comfort. Because sometimes, rebellion is not loud. Sometimes, it is the quiet sound of a factory beginning to hum. For decades, Burkina Faso stood at the heart of the Sahel's endless drought, a land where hope cracked under the same sun that baked its soil. But now, that same horizon is stirring with a different sound, the hum of irrigation pumps and the rhythm of renewal. Last week, Ibrahim Traore stood beside India's Minister of Water Resources to sign what many are calling the boldest agricultural pact in Africa history, a $9 billion irrigation alliance that could change how the Sahel feeds itself. 12 vast water corridors will cut across the heart of Burkina Faso, powered by solar fields and engineered by Bharat Water Tech, financed by India's Exim Bank. The plan? To irrigate 1.2 million hectares, revive local rice and millet production, and free millions of farmers from the chains of imported seeds and fertilizers. But this is not just an economic story. It is a political earthquake. Because for the first time, Burkina Faso's farming future will not depend on Western loans or IMF conditions. Instead, it will depend on South-South cooperation, where the water flows not from charity, but from mutual respect. Western analysts are calling it a quiet revolution. From the markets of Ouagadougou to the fields of Kaya, people are already calling it La Renaissance Verte, the green rebirth. An old farmer told a local radio station, "For the first time, the water is ours." Those 6 words have shaken more than one capital in Europe, because if Burkina Faso can feed itself, it can trade on its own terms. And that threatens an entire model of dependency that has lasted for decades. If this story matters for Africa's future, press like and stay for the full brief. If you're watching from a farming family, type your city below. Let's see who still believes in soil. As irrigation channels begin to fill with new life, another current begins to move across the world. Questions, fears, and calculations. Could this $9 billion water alliance truly bring Africa's green revolution? Or will it open a new trade front that the West cannot control? At sunrise, the convoy rolled quietly into the town of Lumbila, just 15 kilometers from Ouagadougou. Engineers in blue coveralls unloaded crates marked Bharat Water Tech, Solar Flow System. Inside each crate lay the same dream that had once transformed India's own parched plains. A network of intelligent irrigation valves and solar-powered water hubs, the core of Burkina Faso's $9 billion partnership with New Delhi. The official announcement came at a ceremony streamed live across the Sahel. Traore's speech was brief, measured, and proud. He said, "For generations, the hand that fed us was not our own. Today, we water the earth ourselves." Behind him stood rows of young Burkinabe technicians, graduates trained through India's Green Corridor Fellowship. Each had studied precision irrigation, soil mapping, and digital water sensors. They would now lead 12 megaproject zones stretching from Bobo Dioulasso to Dori. The scale is staggering. 1.2 million hectares of farmland linked by 9,000 kilometers of smart canals, each powered by solar fields producing over 600 megawatts. The alliance includes a long-term agricultural credit facility, $2 billion in low-interest financing for local cooperatives to ensure that control of the land stays in Burkinabe hands. This is not charity, it is design. The deal was signed not in Paris, not in Washington, but in Ouagadougou, with Indian engineers shaking hands with African farmers. For both nations, it marks a new era of mutual independence. India gains agricultural corridors for trade and technology exports. Burkina gains food sovereignty and water security. But for Western observers, the alliance is something else, a potential crack in their century-old influence over Africa's food economy. European seed and fertilizer corporations had long dominated Burkina's rural markets, supplying products tied to conditional credits. Now, with India's arrival, that grip begins to loosen. The Wall Street Journal described it as a shift from soft aid to hard strategy. An EU analyst called it a new green belt outside Western reach. Local reaction, however, has been deeply emotional. Crowds gathered near irrigation sites just to see the first channels open. An old woman dipped her hand into the running water and whispered, "It has been 50 years since the soil spoke back." For farmers across the Sahel, this is more than infrastructure. It is identity. Every drop flowing through these pipes tells a new story, one about dignity, control, and self-respect. But the new partnership also raises new questions. India's stake in Africa is growing fast, from energy to defense, from mining to agritech. Some worry this could simply replace one dependency with another. Others see it as an alliance of equals, nations once colonized, now building together. Traore, for his part, appears unmoved by speculation. In a press briefing, he said calmly, "Partnership is not surrender. It is the sharing of strength." He ended with a warning that echoed through every headline. When Africa waters its fields, no one else decides the harvest. If you come from a farming family or once worked the soil, write your city below. Let us see how many still believe in land and labor. The images from satellite now show a new pattern emerging. Grids of green spreading like veins through the Sahel. Each square represents not only a new crop, but also a new kind of sovereignty. In New Delhi, newspapers call it the Great Sahel Project. In Washington, it is being studied as a potential strategic realignment. But for most in Burkina Faso, it is something simpler. Proof that the nation's future will no longer depend on rainfall or foreign mercy. Hold the line. Write one word that captures what this moment means to you. Still, behind the optimism lies tension. Trade analysts warn that global supply routes may soon be redrawn. If India becomes the Sahel's primary partner in agricultural infrastructure, Europe could lose billions in seed and export contracts. Western think tanks speak of market destabilization, but ordinary Africans call it justice, long delayed. As Burkina's pumps hum through the night and canals carve new paths across the desert, another current is forming. Political, invisible, and unstoppable. But why are diplomats in Brussels and Washington suddenly calling for emergency trade assessments? What are they afraid this alliance might unleash? The first sign of unease came not from Africa, but from Brussels. Inside a closed-door meeting at the European Commission, an internal memo warned, "The Burkina-India Irrigation Accord may accelerate the erosion of European agricultural influence in the Sahel corridor within 36 months." Across the Atlantic, Washington analysts sounded equally cautious. One policy brief from the Atlantic Council read, "India is positioning itself as Africa's alternative development partner, not through debt, but through water." It was a polite way of saying that the old system of dependency was now under threat. At the same time, The IIMF's Agricultural Outreach Division quietly postponed 2 upcoming reviews on Sahel farming programs. Programs once tied to fertilizer imports from European companies. The timing was not coincidence. In Ouagadougou, Traore remained calm. At a press conference beneath a blazing afternoon sun, he said, "Every nation that wants Africa to remain thirsty should remember this. The river changes course when the dam breaks." His words spread across social media within hours. Across Africa, hashtags began trending. Hashtag water is freedom and hashtag green Sahel. Meanwhile, in New Delhi, engineers and diplomats toasted to what they called a southward monsoon. India's Prime Minister stated that this is not aid, it is alignment. For the first time, 2 post-colonial nations were shaping a partnership on their own terms, built not on pity, but on parity. Western media coverage grew sharper. One French outlet questioned, "Is India replacing France in West Africa?" Another warned, "Burkina Faso may be creating a dependency that looks different but feels the same." But inside Burkina Faso, those words felt hollow. Because on the ground, the change was real. Farmers who once waited for seasonal rainfall now manage smartphone dashboards showing soil moisture in real time. Children who once fetched water from distant wells now attend irrigation schools built beside solar farms. One village elder described it best. "The white dust that once covered our roofs has turned to green mist. For the first time, we smell rain before it falls." The human impact was unmistakable. Fields that had been barren for decades now shimmered with life. Wheat, rice, and vegetables began flowing into domestic markets. The national grain reserve increased by 32% in 6 months. Prices stabilized. Confidence returned. Still, the deeper transformation was psychological. For generations, Africans were told that food security required Western assistance. Now, the proof of self-reliance ran through the fields like veins of light. Direct CTA. If this moment speaks to you, share your first reaction in 1 sentence. Do you see hope or risk in this alliance? As optimism spread across the region, subtle countermoves began. Western trade envoys proposed new monitoring frameworks for water and land projects. European banks offered fresh lines of credit, with technical supervision clauses. Traore declined them all. In a televised statement, he said, "Our soil will no longer be audited from abroad." That line became a rallying cry. Crowds gathered in Ouagadougou waving small buckets of water, chanting, "We audit ourselves." The symbolism was unmistakable. Water had become not only a resource, but a declaration of independence. But beneath the celebrations, a deeper current of tension pulsed through the Sahel. Western companies began to freeze certain supply contracts. Reports surfaced of logistical slowdowns at border checkpoints. It was as if the world's invisible networks had decided to test Burkina's resolve. Traore, however, appeared unfazed. "We have waited too long for permission to grow," he told his cabinet. "Now we will simply grow." Analysts began to whisper that this was no longer just an irrigation project. It was the birth of a new trade front, one that could redraw alliances across continents. India's engineers were not just building canals, they were building corridors of influence. And the West, once unchallenged in Africa's agricultural sphere, suddenly found itself out of position. Still, the greater story was not about rivalry, but renewal. The fields spoke louder than any headline, and as dusk fell across the Sahel, the sound of flowing water carried a single truth. The future was already here, and it was green. But if water is power, who will hold the valves? And what happens when the first harvest proves the world wrong? In the months that followed, the transformation was not measured only in tons of grain, but in the quiet pride of those who had once lived in drought. The Sahel, long treated as the edge of survival, was becoming the frontier of rebirth. Local cooperatives began forming at a pace unseen in modern Burkina Faso. In the province of Sicily, 3 villages merged their farmland into a 12,000-hectare irrigation cluster, powered by Indian-built solar panels. Young men who had once left for seasonal labor in Côte d'Ivoire returned home to work the fields. Women who had carried buckets from wells now operated digital pumps by touchscreen. The social fabric began to heal. Migration slowed. Village schools reopened. Local markets revived, not with imported goods, but with Burkinabe produce. It was as though each green field whispered the same sentence: "We belong to the land again." But these victories also carried political weight. The alliance with India had quietly shifted the foundation of West African diplomacy. Where once France and the IMF dictated water and crop policies, now regional ministers looked to Ouagadougou, for example. Traore's Greenbelt vision became a talking point in Mali, Niger, and Chad, a model of agricultural sovereignty spreading like wildfire across the Sahel. During a joint AES summit in Niamey, a delegate remarked, "The age of aid is closing. The age of partnership begins." That single line captured the mood of an entire region. In Ouagadougou, government approval ratings rose to record highs. The Ministry of Agriculture reported a 38% increase in food self-sufficiency within 1 fiscal year. Local radio programs began broadcasting water bulletins, not warnings of drought, but updates on irrigation progress. Still, with progress came new forms of pressure. Western trade missions returned, offering joint supervision programs and market stabilization packages. But Traore's government politely refused. The phrase independent management became official policy, written into the National Charter of Agricultural Development. Yet, beneath the optimism, there was a recognition of the challenge ahead. With independence comes responsibility. Maintaining $9 billion worth of irrigation infrastructure demands discipline, transparency, and local accountability. Traore addressed this directly in a televised speech. Sovereignty is not the end of struggle, it is its beginning. The crowd erupted, chanting his name, but his tone remained grave. "We must protect this gift," he said, "from corruption, from carelessness, from forgetting why we started." Direct CTA. If you believe Africa's strength lies in its own hands, press like before you go. If you disagree, tell us why. Respectfully, clearly. The new irrigation corridors soon began to reshape politics beyond Burkina Faso. Regional parties in Mali and Niger adopted slogans inspired by the alliance. Water before debt, soil before sanctions. Across the Sahel, debates over resource control took center stage. For the first time in decades, water, not gold, not oil, became the new axis of power. International observers started using a new phrase, hydro-sovereignty. It described what Traore had accomplished, the ability to use water as both shield and sword in the struggle for self-reliance. But as the world watched the Sahel turn green, quiet resistance brewed in the shadows. European think tanks lobbied for market oversight, while private companies sought loopholes to re-enter the supply chain. Some contracts were frozen, others quietly redirected to neutral partners. Traore's response was measured but firm. He announced a new transparency initiative, requiring all agricultural data to be stored on servers inside Burkina Faso. "Our fields," he said, "will not be managed from the cloud." The spiritual dimension of the change could not be ignored. In Friday prayers and Sunday sermons, imams and pastors alike began referencing the miracle of water. Religious leaders described it as a sign, not of political triumph, but of divine justice. A village priest told a reporter, "Maybe God waited until we found courage to help ourselves." By mid-year, satellite images confirmed what no policy paper could deny. Nearly 400,000 hectares of desert had turned green. And yet, the true measure of this revolution was invisible. It lived in the hearts of people who now believed the future could be grown, not borrowed. But in the corridors of power abroad, new meetings were already underway. Europe, the US, and China were preparing their counteroffers. Would Burkina's green belt remain sovereign, or would the world try to buy the rain? In Washington, the irrigation alliance was not treated as a regional project. It was logged as a strategic disruption. A classified report from the National Intelligence Council, leaked to several media outlets, summarized it bluntly. India's agricultural diplomacy is rewriting West Africa's supply chains faster than expected. Western access to Sahel markets could drop by 40% within 5 years. For the first time, analysts began to discuss the Green Corridor Challenge, a phrase describing how nations like Burkina Faso and India were using infrastructure, not ideology, to realign power. At a Senate subcommittee hearing, one U.S. official admitted, "If this model spreads, Western leverage in African food policy collapses." Behind the rhetoric lay quiet concern. American agri-tech firms, long accustomed to exporting to the Sahel, saw their contracts reduced by half. European producers faced tariff discussions over water technology. France's agricultural exporters, already struggling with domestic protests, now faced the reality of losing Africa's fastest-growing farm market. India, on the other hand, framed the alliance as a moral partnership, proof that two former colonies could trade dignity for dignity. At a Delhi forum titled "Feeding the Future," a senior minister declared, "When nations learn to share water, they no longer trade chains." That message resonated deeply in the global South. Across Asia and Africa, leaders watched closely, studying the Burkina blueprint, a cooperation model without the political traps of debt or austerity. Still, skepticism persisted. Western think tanks warned that India's influence in the Sahel could carry long-term political cost. Some suggested that the U.S. might need its own Green Partnership initiative to maintain presence in the region. The irony was unmistakable. For decades, Washington and Brussels had encouraged African self-reliance. Now that it was happening, they called it destabilizing. If you want calm, fact-based Africa coverage, press subscribe now. We'll track how Washington and Delhi move next. Even China, long dominant in African infrastructure, began recalibrating its tone. Analysts in Beijing saw India's rise as both competition and complement. "Africa's green race," one Chinese commentator wrote, "will decide who owns tomorrow's water." But the U.S. media narrative shifted quickly. Major outlets started framing Traore not as a rebel, but as a reformer, the man who turned irrigation into independence. A former State Department official, speaking anonymously, said, "It's hard to oppose food and dignity. You can't sanction water." And so the question reached a new level. If water diplomacy could realign the Sahel, what might energy, trade, or digital networks do next? The irrigation deal was never just about crops. It was the first signal of a deeper geopolitical tide. But how long can one small nation hold its course between great powers? And what will Traore do when the next offer comes? One that no leader has yet refused. As the sun lowers over the Sahel, the landscape no longer looks like the edge of the world. The canals shimmer gold in the evening light, and from a distance you can hear the low hum of pumps feeding the soil. The land that once begged for mercy now breathes on its own. In a village near Zinyare, a small boy stands at the edge of the new canal. His grandfather hands him a seed and says, "Plant it today, so tomorrow no one can say we waited for rain." That single gesture explains what no report or headline can. It is not just about irrigation. It is about inheritance. Ibrahim Traore's irrigation alliance with India has become more than an engineering feat. It is a statement that sovereignty is not built in conferences, but in furrows and calloused hands. And perhaps this is what frightens old powers the most, that Africa's quiet revolutions now begin with water, not war. For the United States and Europe, the question remains, will they adapt to this new world of partnership or cling to a past built on control? The next decade may not be defined by missiles or sanctions, but by who can grow food and who must buy it. If this story gave you clarity, press like to lock it in. If it challenged your view, write your counterpoint. Calm, fair, and factual. In the fields of Burkina Faso, the first harvest from the new canals is expected within 6 months. It will not just feed millions, it will feed belief. The belief that a nation once dismissed as poor can turn its deserts into gardens. And as the green spreads across the Sahel, one truth becomes clear. The future does not arrive. It is planted. If the spirit of Ibrahim Traore's vision touched you tonight, share this story, not for politics, but for memory. Because when a people take back their land, they take back their voice. May every drop of water in the Sahel carry this message forward. Africa will not wait for permission to grow. Could this $9 billion irrigation alliance truly spark a new trade front? Perhaps. But maybe, just maybe, it has already sparked something far greater. The return of faith in Africa's own hands. Ouagadougou, once a city of dust and concrete, now wrapped in green. From the air, a wide ring of farmland circles the capital like a living wall. 2,000 hectares of vegetables, canals, and solar pumps, built not by foreign aid, but by Burkinabe hands. This is not another donor project. It is a quiet revolution that began with a single sentence from President Ibrahim Traore: food independence through unity. At first, few believed it could work. Urban land was scarce, rainfall was uneven. The West had taught Africa to import, not to grow. But something shifted. The same generation that once dreamed of leaving now stayed to plant. Former soldiers built irrigation lines. Engineers wrote code for soil sensors. Mothers turned backyards into seed banks. What looked like a farming plan became an act of defiance. Today, markets inside Ouagadougou sell lettuce that traveled only 8 kilometers. Fuel use is down. Prices have stabilized. The city eats what it grows, and the world is watching, because behind every tomato and grain of millet lies a question larger than agriculture itself. Can Africa rewrite the rules of trade by reclaiming the soil beneath its feet? If this story matters for Africa's dignity, press like and stay. If you want the next chapter of Traore's plan, subscribe before you forget. In the minutes ahead, we will walk the belt itself, meet the farmers who replaced dependency with discipline, and examine how one green ring is unsettling Europe's trade calculus. You will hear numbers, but you will also hear heartbeat, because this story is not about policy. It is about people deciding that sovereignty begins with soil. So listen closely. The hum you hear in the background is not traffic. It is the sound of solar pumps pulling water through red earth. It is the sound of a country that no longer waits for permission to feed itself. If you felt hope in that sound, say hope in the comments so others can see it. And as we begin, remember this simple truth. Before a nation can stand tall, it must first learn to grow its own bread. In late 2024, the first excavators arrived at the edges of Ouagadougou. No international flags, no UN trucks, only local crews with dusty boots and quiet determination. What they began to mark was the foundation of Burkina Faso's most ambitious experiment. A 2,000-hectare urban agriculture belt, a continuous chain of fields, greenhouses, and solar-powered canals designed to circle the capital like a living fortress. The idea was simple, yet radical. Every city consumes, few cities produce. Traore's government asked, what if a capital could feed itself? The answer came in steel pipes and seedlings. Engineers from the Polytechnic University designed low-cost irrigation grids powered by 1,500 solar units. Each grid connected 10 cooperatives, local farmers, students, and retired workers, all owning their share of land under the National Food Sovereignty Act. Within 6 months, what had been empty peri-urban land turned into a patchwork of color. Green okra rows, red soil, blue reservoirs, and white shade nets. The Ministry of Agriculture named it the Green Shield. It was not a metaphor. In a time when sanctions and logistics had cut supply routes, food became defense. The results came faster than expected. By March 2025, the belt supplied 45% of the city's vegetable demand. Tomatoes that once traveled from Marseille or Accra now grew less than 10 kilometers away. Families saved money, small restaurants reopened. Children returned to school because their mothers no longer spent mornings hunting for rice. Still, the project's real success was not yield, it was dignity. Farmers who once worked for export now worked for home. Each cooperative had a digital board showing real-time sales. Data replaced middlemen. For every kilogram sold, the system displayed what part stayed in Burkina, what paid for solar maintenance, and what went into the cooperative's fund. Transparency became national pride. Western consultants were skeptical. They called it inefficient, small-scale, uncompetitive. But Traore's team understood the larger picture. Sovereignty is not about scale. It is about control. Every ton grown locally meant 1 ton less imported, 1 invoice less owed. In one televised briefing, the Minister of Trade stood before the belt and declared, "This is our second gold, but it grows from soil, not from mines." The phrase spread across Africa's media like wildfire. Burkina Faso's urban belt began exporting knowledge instead of raw materials. Delegations from Mali, Niger, and Ghana arrived to study it. In Bamako, a 400-hectare pilot followed. In Niamey, the same design took shape under local engineers. For the first time, food policy moved faster than diplomacy. And yet, every revolution meets resistance. Imported distributors, once dominant in Burkina's food chain, faced new rules. Supermarkets had to purchase a fixed percentage from domestic cooperatives. European importers warned of market distortion. Letters arrived from Brussels questioning quality compliance. But the tone of the government remained calm. "We are not closing doors," Traore said. "We are opening our own." At the same time, young entrepreneurs built phone apps linking consumers to local farms. Faso Fresh became a hit in Ouagadougou's middle class. Housewives could now scan a QR code to see which cooperative grew their food and how much water it used. Food transparency, once a Western luxury, became an African export. When asked by a journalist if he feared retaliation or trade backlash, a senior advisor replied, "We have been sanctioned for far less than growing our own food." The room went silent. In the fields, no one talked about politics. They talked about rain, harvest, and children. Awa, a widow from Sector 30, said, "I used to wait for aid trucks. Now they wait for my delivery." Her laughter, captured in one short clip, reached 2 million views across Francophone Africa. That moment became a symbol, the laughter of a woman who no longer begged, but bargained. If this story touched your sense of justice, press like before it is buried. If you believe every city should feed its people first, say stand firm in the comments. Because what Burkina Faso planted was not only food, it planted defiance, a green ring that said, without anger or slogans, "We will not kneel to hunger again." By mid-2025, the belt was no longer a local experiment. It had become a geopolitical statement. What began as quiet irrigation around Ouagadougou had started to disrupt trade charts in Brussels and Paris. Import statistics showed a sudden drop. Burkina's demand for European vegetables fell by nearly 40%. The numbers looked small on paper, but the symbolism was enormous. A nation that once relied on aid to survive was now trimming Western profits simply by feeding itself. Then came the storm. The European Food Standards Office issued a memo warning of non-compliant quality processes. Media headlines framed it as Burkina's gray zone agriculture. Within days, analysts began talking about trade friction risk. But inside the country, people saw it differently. For them, it was proof that independence had finally touched something real, the dinner table. President Ibrahim Traore addressed the criticism in one of his most watched speeches. They said we could not build our own gold refineries. We did. They said we could not power our own cities. We did. And now they say we cannot grow our own food. We will. The crowd erupted. That clip alone reached millions of African viewers who had once doubted if self-reliance could still be profitable. Within the following weeks, neighboring Mali and Niger announced they would replicate the urban agriculture model. 3 capitals, 1 vision, a corridor of green sovereignty stretching through the Sahel. Western media labeled it the eco-nationalist bloc. African outlets called it the Green Alliance. Foreign investors began to worry. Local supply meant fewer contracts for European distributors, less dependency on Western logistics, and smaller aid programs. Behind closed doors, embassies drafted policy notes suggesting conditional partnerships. One Western diplomat, off record, admitted they've rewritten the rules without signing a single treaty. At home, something deeper was changing. Farmers who once feared losing markets now feared losing control. They organized cooperatives not to resist the West, but to protect the integrity of their success. For the first time, the word sovereignty entered everyday conversation, in markets, churches, and schools. Still, the backlash intensified. The EU proposed stricter labeling for African produce, delaying shipments and driving up costs. Burkina responded by tightening tariffs on imported processed foods. The standoff escalated into what local media called the quiet trade war. Western think tanks warned of economic isolation, but the data told another story. Unemployment among Burkinabe youth dropped 14% in a single year. Food inflation stayed at its lowest level in a decade. Hospitals reported better nutrition rates. The success was visible, measurable, and undeniable. The emotional climax came not in a speech, but in silence, the kind of silence that follows realization. In the villages surrounding Ouagadougou, farmers began to say, "We are free when our children eat what we grow." That sentence traveled further than any political slogan. In the U.S., think tank panels started debating whether this new agricultural self-reliance could shift Africa's trade future. If it scales, one analyst said, the entire aid model collapses. The comment drew applause from African students attending the event. Across the Atlantic, the belt kept expanding. New greenhouses opened every week. Small drones monitored soil moisture. Data centers tracked production. What the West saw as isolation, Burkina saw as rebirth. And yet, Traore remained cautious. In a rare interview, he said softly, "We are not fighting the world. We are simply learning to stand without leaning." Those words captured the spirit of the movement, calm, firm, and rooted. If this feels like a turning point, write your city below. If you want part 2 on Traore's food strategy, subscribe now. Because what is growing in Ouagadougou is no longer just food. It is proof that a small nation, by mastering its soil, can alter the logic of empires. The belt had crossed its point of no return. It was no longer a project, it was a precedent. By late 2025, the 2,000-hectare belt was more than an agricultural zone. It had become the backbone of a new social order. Every sunrise, thousands of men and women moved across the green fields surrounding Ouagadougou like the pulse of a living organism. The rhythm of shovels and solar pumps replaced the old noise of waiting for imports, waiting for aid, waiting for someone else to decide when they could eat. In Sector 30, a widow named Awa rose before dawn to check the drip lines on her lettuce patch. She used to sell peanuts by the roadside, earning just enough to survive. Now her produce supplies a hospital kitchen. Her earnings doubled, her children returned to school, and she speaks of soil the way others speak of freedom. "I no longer count the coins," she said. "I count the people who eat." Her story aired on national radio, and for the first time listeners cried not from tragedy, but from pride. The transformation reached deep into civic life. Veterans who once guarded checkpoints now maintained irrigation grids. Youth who once migrated to France stayed to run farm drones. The city's jobless rate fell to its lowest level in 15 years. Crime declined. Markets stayed open after dark. Families felt a kind of quiet security that no foreign peacekeeping mission had ever delivered. Inside the capital, politics shifted tone. Lawmakers who once debated foreign loans now argued over water rights and land zoning. Parliamentary sessions opened with statistics on food yield instead of deficit ratios. The Ministry of Commerce introduced a new term, Local Equilibrium Index. It measured how self-sufficient each district had become. Citizens followed those numbers the way Americans follow stock prices. But not everyone celebrated. Import lobbies saw their profits shrink. Certain elites complained that tariffs on foreign goods hurt the urban upper class. The government answered bluntly, if sovereignty has a price, it is cheaper than dependence. That phrase spread through social media, printed on posters, sung in folk songs. In daily life, the belt's impact was visible in small miracles. Vegetables in every school meal, hospital diets improved, markets filled year-round. During the 2025 drought that scorched parts of Niger and Ghana, Burkina's capital remained supplied. Neighboring nations sent observers. Aid agencies quietly studied the model they once dismissed. One evening, a journalist asked an old farmer what had changed most. He looked at the horizon and said, "Silence. We no longer wait for the convoy." That sentence captured a national mood. Peace through productivity. Meanwhile, global headlines painted two different pictures. Western outlets called the policy protectionist populism. African papers called it the return of common sense. On the streets, people didn't care about terminology. They cared that food prices stopped rising, while hope began to. Community cooperatives started small funds for education and healthcare. Each harvest, 10% of profits went to public projects, water towers, solar lamps, school supplies. In less than a year, 47 rural clinics received new equipment paid entirely by farmers. The poor were helping the poorer. Even faith leaders joined the transformation. Friday sermons and Sunday masses echoed the same message. Blessed is the hand that feeds before it asks. For a society long shaped by external charity, that line felt like a rebirth. If this moved you, write, "I remember" below. If you believe dignity begins with work, press like so others can see it. In the end, the belt redrew more than trade lines. It redrew the psychology of a nation. No speech could match the sight of thousands harvesting under the same sun, each row of crops a quiet vote for independence. And as the West watched through satellite images, wondering what would grow next, the people of Burkina Faso already knew. They had turned the soil into sovereignty. By the time Washington and Brussels understood what had happened, the numbers were undeniable. Burkina Faso's import bill for basic foods had fallen by 42%. The country that once begged for grain credits was now exporting small solar irrigation units to its neighbors. In trade rooms across the Atlantic, analysts struggled to explain how a landlocked nation had outmaneuvered billion-dollar aid programs using nothing more than discipline and soil. At the International Monetary Fund, quiet conversations began. Localized resilience, one report called it. In plain words, it meant a country that didn't need rescuing anymore. For an institution built on dependency, that idea was unsettling. The European Union called the project anomalous. French media called it eco-nationalism. But African commentators called it maturity. In the United States, the tone was mixed. Some policymakers saw the belt as a stabilizing model for fragile regions. Others worried it could reduce Western leverage in West Africa's food and trade networks. The Pentagon's Sahel brief mentioned strategic resilience infrastructure, a polite phrase meaning Burkina is harder to pressure now. On American talk shows, few viewers knew where Ouagadougou was, but they recognized the spirit. "That's what we used to call self-reliance," one veteran said on air. His words drew applause. For many older Americans who lived through eras of sacrifice, The idea of a small nation feeding itself without handouts felt strangely familiar, a mirror of values long forgotten. China and Russia observed silently, sensing opportunity. They offered equipment, training, and trade links, but Traore's government remained cautious. Cooperation, yes. Dependency, no. The message was consistent. Burkina would trade, not kneel. Global NGOs found themselves cornered. For decades, they justified budgets through African hunger. Now a single project had questioned their entire model. The World Food Programme's 2025 review quietly acknowledged domestic innovation outperforming external aid. It was a diplomatic way of saying, "We have been surpassed." If you value truth over image, press like before this disappears. If you want clear follow-ups on Africa's trade realignment, subscribe now. Because beyond the data, one reality stands. The balance of power in Africa is no longer written in gold or oil. It's written in grain and water. And every acre Burkina cultivates shifts that balance a little more. The West calls it a disruption. Africa calls it a beginning. At sunset, the belt around Ouagadougou glows like a halo. 2,000 hectares of green, neither monument nor miracle, but the proof of a promise kept. In a world obsessed with currency reserves and foreign reserves, Burkina Faso discovered a quieter form of wealth, the ability to feed its own children. President Ibrahim Traore once said, "He who controls his bread controls his destiny." For months, that line sounded like a slogan. Today, it reads like a prophecy. The 2,000-hectare belt has become both shield and teacher. It showed that sovereignty is not declared, it is cultivated, row by row, under a sun that belongs to no one else. Across Africa, leaders are taking note. In Bamako, in Niamey, in Accra, engineers trace the same circles on their maps. They are not copying a project, they are imitating courage. The courage to start small, to depend on their own hands first. For the West, the question is uncomfortable. How do you negotiate with a continent that no longer needs to beg? For Africa, the answer is clear. Feed the people, and politics will follow. If this story gave you hope, press like before you leave. If you believe dignity begins with work, say, "Stand firm" in the comments. If you want the next chapter of Africa's Green Revolution, subscribe now so you don't miss it. Pause for a moment. Picture Awa in her field at dawn, the widow who once waited for aid trucks, now delivering to hospitals. Her laughter travels farther than any speech at the UN, because power, in the end, is not the ability to command, it is the ability to provide. And when historians look back on this decade, they may not speak first of gold or wars, but of soil, of the day a small nation redrew the rules of trade simply by planting its own food. If you felt that truth, write "recorded" below, so history cannot erase it. May God bless Africa, the land that chose to grow rather than bow. May its soil remain fertile, its people steadfast, and its freedom rooted deep. This is Burkina Faso's harvest. This is how sovereignty tastes.